The minute we say that there's an ideal or standard for human conduct and character, a question arises, or it should naturally arise, especially for Aristotle, because Aristotle, we have to say, is the common sense philosopher. In other words, all that Aristotle starts with are our common sense assumptions from our common experience as humans. That's why what he says seems so convincing to the average person. And if I say, common sense wise, that look, there's an ideal standard for human conduct, then the question arises, well, then how can everything be a product of mere chance or the blind forces of nature? If I spill milk on the floor, the shape that arises can't be judged. You can't say, oh, that's not quite right. The trickle to the left should have been more to the right. This makes no sense, precisely because it's an accident. There is no standard. So the minute we say there's human virtue, which as we saw is arete or excellence, and we see that this is based on proper function, then this all assumes that there's an intention behind human existence. And intentions don't occur except by design. So the totality of Aristotle's account of what it is to be a good human therefore assumes design. And by assuming design, it assumes a designer or a creator, i.e., God. And this was not lost on Aristotle. Aristotle, in another book called the Metaphysics, realizes that his whole account, not only of ethics, but of the totality of existence and where it comes from, assumes that there must be a God. And so he goes about and tries to show that scientifically, we can prove the existence of a supreme, ultimately perfect being, which you and I call God, and Aristotle did too. And therefore he says the ultimate science is not physics, but what goes above physics, the metaphysics, which he says is just another name for theology, the study of ultimate causes, or God. So what we want to do today is show how this leads to Christians, when Christianity becomes dominant in the Roman Empire in the West, really liking Aristotle. They appropriate him because they see that his entire account matches very well with the Christian and Jewish view of the universe. And that he does this not through revelation, not through God revealing himself and saying, oh, here I am, you see there's a God, but rather through reason itself. And so what we see here is the first questions of how does science and faith reconcile? How does faith and reason work together? Comes to the fore and is very important throughout the Christian centuries, which we call the Middle Ages, all the way up through the Renaissance and through and into the Enlightenment, when all of this gets called into question. So now what we're going to do in this lecture is talk about, well, what reasoning was used to prove the existence of God? Here's one thing that wasn't done. Experience was never used as a test for whether God existed or not. Aristotle realizes that God, or a perfect being, would have to be without limits. And so anything that you could possibly see, any miracle, any great act, would have to have limits, otherwise you couldn't see it. And so it follows from that whatever you witnessed through observation couldn't prove the existence of God. At most, it could prove the existence of a very powerful extraterrestrial being. A God with a little g, perhaps, but not the supreme God. So how do we go about proving it? Well, we've shown already one example, through the effects of such a being. When we look at the world and we see humans and organic things, we see that every part works together for a single function, and therefore that they had a designer. But Aristotle looked more generally too and saw that everything you look at, every kind of thing, follows lawful patterns. Now, one way to talk about these lawful patterns is to say that everything, when you look at the link between the causes of the thing and its effects, follows these set patterns or tendencies. So when you release a stone, what does it do? It doesn't go up sometimes and down at other times. It doesn't make a zigzag one day and go straight the next day. It always tends to follow the same pattern. Things throughout nature aim at certain results. Now, when things aim at things, either they're conscious or they're directed by some conscious being, some rational being, towards some end or goal. And since everything therefore has these goals or tendencies, it follows that behind everything is some goal. This is the first and most popular argument for the existence of a designer or a creator. It's called the teleological proof because it's based on this idea of goal, or telos in the Greek, the argument from design. This argument was so popular that even today, those physicists who believe in God often use the fact that the parameters in which the Big Bang occurred are so narrow and so unlikely that a slight variation would create a chaotic and not living universe, a universe incapable of supporting life. This is another argument from design. It's an argument that when we look at the likelihood of things occurring by chance, they're so low that we have to postulate a designer. So one thing you see about teleological proofs is that they're arguments from probability. They're not absolute proofs because things could accidentally occur that look designed. That is what evolution is supposed to show. But nonetheless, the likelihood, the claim is, of that happening is so low that we have to postulate some rational being or designer behind the creation of the cosmos or the universe. Aristotle doesn't rely on that, even though it's assumed in his account of ethics. What he relies on is what he sees as an absolute deductive proof for the existence of God, and those arguments are called cosmological proofs, from the word cosmos in the Greek, which means world. In other words, if we look at the entire world of cause and effect, we see that we have to ask, where did the universe come from? What is the cause of the universe? In our next lecture, we will look specifically at Aristotle's proofs, but we're going to look at them specifically through the writing of one of the most famous Christian philosophers, Thomas Aquinas. I have given you a handout which outlines in a couple pages his famous 5 ways of proving the existence of God. I've outlined already the basic 5th way, which is the argument from design, but we're specifically going to concentrate on his first 2 ways. These are cosmological proofs. The argument, which can basically be said, is when we look around us, we see there are things that have causes. And ultimately, in order to explain their existence, the only way is to say there is a creator and that this creator has all of the attributes which we would attribute to God. Boethius, who we are studying in this module, will use such an argument combining these two, and we'll look at his arguments later on in the module. But he also brings up another kind of argument which is very popular and is equivalent to Aquinas' 4th way, and that's the idea of there being this ultimate standard of perfection, whether moral or just looking at things. We see that there's a hierarchy of things that are more or less perfect, and there couldn't be a measurement or comparison of things being more or less perfect, imperfect, degrees of perfection, unless there was an ultimately perfect standard, things to which everything else is compared, i.e. a perfect being. And that is the 3rd type of argument for the existence of God. Notice none of these assume that we can see God. They all realize that an infinite being could never be seen, that if we're going to understand or know the existence of such a being, it will have to be through the being's effects. that being the only explanation for the types of effects we do observe. And that's what science does. None of us can see gravity. None of us can see atoms or electrons. The only reason we know they exist is because, scientifically speaking, they're the only adequate explanations for the things we do observe in nature.